The screams echo across the dark water, bouncing off the surrounding pines like a twisted game of telephone. My sister's voice. I'll never forget how it changed from playful laughter to pure terror in an instant. Even now, 5 years later, I wake up in cold sweats hearing that sound. But to understand the true horror of what happened at Black Lake, you need to know the whole story. Why we were there, why we ignored all the warnings, and what ancient evil we accidentally awakened from its centuries-long slumber. The screams echo across the dark water, bouncing off the surrounding pines like a twisted game of telephone. My sister's voice. I'll never forget how it changed from playful laughter to pure terror in an instant. Even now, 5 years later, I wake up in cold sweats, hearing that sound. But to understand the true horror of what happened at Black Lake, you need to know the whole story. It started with my mom's obsession with authentic travel experiences. She'd spent months planning our summer vacation, determined to find somewhere off the beaten path. The problem with tourist spots, she always said, is that they're full of tourists. Looking back, maybe there was a reason why Black Lake wasn't featured in mainstream travel guides. We first heard about Pine Haven from some obscure travel blog called Hidden Gems of the Northwest. The post painted an idyllic picture, a pristine mountain lake surrounded by ancient forest, small town charm, and best of all, barely any visitors. Dad was sold the moment he saw photos of the lake's supposedly excellent fishing spots. My sister Emma, 14 and going through her photography phase, couldn't stop talking about the perfect Instagram shots she'd get. Me? I was 16 and too cool to be excited about a family vacation, but even I had to admit the place looked beautiful in those carefully filtered photos. The drive into Pine Haven was our first hint that something was off. The main road had been well maintained, but the moment we turned onto the lake access road, it was like entering another world. The pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. The dense pines pressed in from both sides, creating a tunnel of green that seemed to swallow our SUV. Emma kept trying to take photos, but complained that none of them were coming out right, like the forest was too dark, too dense to capture properly. We passed a faded wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Haven, established 1892. Below it, someone had spray-painted "Turn Back" in red letters. Dad joked about small towns trying to keep their secret spots private, but Mom's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The town itself looked frozen in time. Weather-beaten buildings lined the main street, their paint peeling like old scabs. A few locals were out, but they stopped what they were doing to watch our car pass. Not the usual curious looks tourists get. These stares held something darker. Concern? Fear? At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. We needed supplies before heading to our rental cabin, so we stopped at Jensen's General Store, one of those places that seems to sell everything from fishing tackle to funeral supplies. The bell above the door jangled as we entered, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Behind the counter stood an old man who could have been anywhere from 60 to 100. His face mapped with deep wrinkles that spoke of decades under harsh mountain sun. "Visitors," he said. It wasn't a question. His roomy eyes tracked us as Mom loaded our basket with essentials. When she mentioned we were staying at Black Lake, his weathered hands froze in the act of stocking canned beans. "Black Lake ain't for swimming," he said, his voice like gravel under tires. "Not since the mining accident back in '32. Dad gave his standard humoring the locals' chuckle. "Oh? What happened in '32? The old man, Mr. Jensen himself, we later learned, didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out toward where the lake lay hidden behind the trees. Company was mining silver in these hills, dug too deep, broke into an underwater cavern system, flooded half their tunnels. He turned back to us, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. They sealed it up best they could, but they awoke something down there. Something that should have stayed sleeping. Mom and Dad exchanged their patented crazy local folklore looks, but Emma was intrigued. "What kind of something?" she asked. Jensen's eyes locked onto my sister with an intensity that made me step closer to her. "The kind that hungers, young lady. The kind that's been down there longer than our kind has walked these hills. The kind that's enough ghost stories for one day," Dad interrupted, putting a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "We'll be careful, sir. Thank you for the warning." As we checked out, Jensen slipped something into our bag. I found it later. A small hand-carved wooden charm in the shape of an eye. There was writing on the back in what looked like Latin, but I couldn't make it out. The rental cabin was about a mile from town, set back from the lake's edge in a small clearing. It was rustic but well-maintained, with a large deck facing the water. The lake itself was massive, stretching toward distant mountains that reflected perfectly on its mirror-like surface. No boats disturbed the water. We'd learn later that locals refused to put anything larger than a kayak on Black Lake. And even then, they stayed in the shallows. That first evening, as we unpacked, I noticed Emma siding at her bedroom window, staring at the lake. "Does the water look weird to you?" she asked when I joined her. I knew what she meant. Despite the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the lake remained stubbornly dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Dinner was Mom's attempt at camping-style hot dogs roasted over the fire pit on the deck. As we ate, Dad tried to lighten the mood by researching the area's history on his tablet. The internet connection was spotty, but he managed to find some information about the mining accident. The official story matched Jensen's account, at least the part about flooded tunnels, but there were forum posts and local news articles that hinted at something more. "Listen to this," Dad read. "In the months following the accident, 7 miners who'd been part of the rescue effort disappeared without trace. Local authorities blamed mountain lions, but some residents reported seeing strange lights under the lake's surface and hearing what they described as singing late at night." He laughed, but it sounded forced. That night, I couldn't sleep. The darkness pressing against my window seemed absolute, and the usual forest sounds, crickets, owls, small animals, were conspicuously absent. Around 2 a.m. I heard it. A soft, melodic humming coming from the direction of the lake. It almost sounded like voices, but the notes were wrong somehow, as if they were being produced by something that didn't quite understand how human music should work. I crept onto the deck to investigate. The moon was nearly full, but its light seemed to stop at the lake's edge, creating a perfect rectangle of blackness. As I watched, ripples appeared in the center, but there was no wind, and the air was completely still. "You hear it too." Emma's voice behind me made me jump. She joined me at the railing, her camera hanging around her neck. "I want to get some night shots." "Maybe we should go inside," I suggested, but she was already heading down the deck stairs toward the shore. That's when I noticed the carved warning, illuminated by her camera's display screen. "The Deep One's hunger," gouged into the bottom stair with what must have been a knife or sharp stone. The next morning, I tried to show Mom and Dad the carving, but in daylight it looked old, weathered, like it had been there for years. They dismissed it as typical cabin graffiti, probably done by teenagers trying to scare tourists. But I noticed Mom checking her phone repeatedly, though there was barely any signal. I spent that day researching everything I could find about Black Lake, using the cabin's weak Wi-Fi. Most sources just mentioned its depth, over 300 feet in some spots. And the mining history. But on a local paranormal forum, I found scattered accounts of disappearances spanning decades. They followed a pattern. Swimmers vanishing suddenly. No bodies ever recovered. Strange sounds or lights reported in the days leading up to each incident. The most recent was just 2 years ago. A college student who'd ignored locals' warnings about night swimming. As I read, the temperature in my room seemed to drop. I looked up to find my window had fogged over, despite the summer heat outside. In the condensation, something had drawn a crude symbol, like a spiral with eyes, but when I blinked, it was gone. The heat on our third day was oppressive, the kind that makes the air feel like soup. Even Dad, who'd been nervously watching the lake's surface during his morning coffee, suggested a swim. "It's just a lake," he said, more to himself than to us. People's imaginations run wild in small towns. We packed a picnic lunch and headed down to the small beach area near our cabin. The sand was dark and fine, almost like volcanic ash. Emma immediately started taking photos, exclaiming about how the water looked so clear near the shore, yet became absolutely black just a few yards out. Mom spread our blanket well back from the water's edge, but the heat eventually drove her to join us. The water was shockingly cold, colder than a mountain lake should be in summer. Emma was the first to swim out past the shallows, testing her new underwater camera. "The visibility is amazing," she called back, "but it gets super dark past the drop-off." I followed her out, noting how the temperature seemed to plummet the deeper we went. About 30 feet from shore, my feet could no longer touch bottom. The water below was an inky void that made my chest tight with instinctive fear. That's when I noticed the humming, the same melody from last night, but stronger now, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you hear that?" I called to Emma, but she was focused on her camera, diving under to take pictures of whatever she saw in the depths. When she surfaced, her expression had changed. "There's something down there," she said, her voice shaking. I think I saw. That's when it happened. One moment Emma was treading water. The next, she was yanked under with such force that it created a whirlpool effect. Her scream was cut off as she disappeared into the blackness. Without thinking, I dove after her. The cold hit me like a physical blow, and the darkness was absolute. I couldn't tell which way was up. The humming was deafening now, reverberating through my bones. In the darkness, something moved, something massive. I caught glimpses of pale flesh, of limbs that were too long, too fluid in their movement, and eyes. Countless eyes that glowed with their own sickly light. I broke the surface, gasping, just in time to hear Dad splash as he dove in. Mom was screaming from the shore, pointing at dark shapes emerging from the water all around us. They rose slowly, deliberately, water cascading from bodies that seemed to constantly shift between human and something else entirely. Their faces were almost beautiful in their alienness, features that suggested humanity while completely defying it. One of them spoke. The sound was like water moving through ancient pipes, like stones grinding against each other in the deep. "The blood price," it said, in perfect English, though its mouth didn't move quite right. "The miners paid it first. Now you." Dad was still searching frantically for Emma, unaware of the horrors surfacing around him. "Here!" he shouted suddenly, diving again. It was the last time I heard his voice. The water around him erupted as multiple pale forms descended, pulling him under with terrifying speed. I somehow made it to shore, though my memories of those moments are fragmented. Mom grabbed my arm and we ran, her screams mixing with that awful humming. Behind us, I heard splashing, then a sound like singing, but all wrong. Notes that human vocal cords couldn't possibly produce. The police search lasted 2 weeks. They found our picnic blanket, some of Emma's camera equipment, and one of Dad's shoes. Professional divers attempted to search the deeper parts of the lake, but reported equipment malfunctions and unusual conditions that made it impossible. One diver quit on the spot after surfacing, refusing to explain what he'd seen. The official report labeled it a tragic drowning accident. Mom and I moved away immediately after the funeral. Empty caskets for both of them. She doesn't talk about that day, doesn't acknowledge anything unusual happened. But she never goes swimming anymore, and she's developed a deep fear of large bodies of water. As for me, I've spent the last 5 years researching similar incidents around the world. There are other lakes with similar histories, places where ancient things slumber in the deep, occasionally rising to collect their blood price. The locals always know. They carve their warnings, pass down their legends, try to protect foolish tourists from threats they can't possibly understand. A week after the incident, Emma's underwater camera washed up on shore. Most of the memory card was corrupted, but 3 images survived. The first shows her smiling face above the water, the dark lake stretching behind her. The second is mostly blackness, except for a pale, elongated hand reaching up from the depths. The third I keep locked away. Sometimes I take it out, usually late at night when I can't sleep. It shows something rising from the darkness behind my sister. A face that's almost human, wearing an expression of ancient hunger and terrible joy. The lake is still there, still drawing tourists despite the legends. On the new tourism website, they recommend staying out of the water. Pollution concerns, they claim. But the locals know better. They say on quiet nights, when the moon is dark and the air is still, you can hear singing from the lake. Multiple voices, harmonizing in impossible ways. And sometimes, just sometimes, they say you can hear a young girl's voice among them, calling out to her family to join her in the deep. I know I'll never go back to Black Lake, but sometimes in my dreams, I hear that singing. And in those moments between sleeping and waking, I swear I can understand the words, ancient promises of secrets and wonders waiting in the darkness below. Maybe that's how they lure people in, generation after generation. Or maybe it's just my guilt talking, my mind trying to make sense of something that defies explanation. Either way, if you're ever driving through the Northwest and see a sign for Pine Haven, keep going. Some lakes are best left undisturbed, some depths best left unplumbed. Because sometimes, the things that dwell in the deep aren't content to simply hunger. Sometimes they want to share their song, to draw others down into their lightless realm. And once you hear their melody, a part of you will always long to return, to sink beneath the surface of Black Lake, and finally learn what dwells in its ancient depths.